We're going to begin lesson 4.5 today, which is kind of reviewing something we did in Unit 1, and we've done a couple of times since then. And that's looking at the coordinate plane, knowing how to plot on it, but also some extra information about it. We'll continue this in our next lesson, then in lesson 4.5b. And just as we start any lesson in our book, we want to know what our objective is. What is our goal for this particular lesson? And it's to be able to say that I can recognize rational numbers, all counting numbers, including zero, and be able to graph them on a coordinate plane, figure out where they go, and be able to put a point. Now, as we do that, then we also have this introduction to an idea of Roman numerals. And some of us know what Roman numerals are, and some of us just simply do not. So I just want to introduce this to you and maybe review it for some of you. First, we look at the word numerals, and it just simply means numbers. So the Roman culture, they would use letters to indicate their numbers, and you can see that throughout all of their historical documents. They would use a capital I to represent the number 1. And they would use that and add as well as subtract to indicate different numbers. So if I put two I's together, two capital I's, and that represented the number 2, and then like the suffix at the end of my name, if I have three capital I's, then that would represent 3. Now we're going to skip 4 for just a moment because then we see that they use different letters to indicate different groupings of numbers. So when I look at the number 5, it is a capital V. So indicating 4, they would indicate that they're going to subtract 1 from the V by writing IV. And IV, that's 5 minus 1, is going to give you 4. So anytime you see a capital I followed by a capital V, then you know that's 4 because the V is 5. And then as they continued, they started with 5 and they added to it until we got to 9. So when I look at the V and I, so V plus 1, 5 plus 1 gives me 6. And a VII, we have 5 plus 2 because that's 7. And VII would be 5 plus 3, which is 8. Now we would switch our letter because in a grouping of 10, then I have an X. X equals 10. And therefore, if I want to go to 9, which is 1 less than 10, I'm going to have 1 in front of the 10 because that would indicate subtraction. So an IX is how they would show the number 9 because that's saying 10 minus 1. Now, that is not the way that we look at numbers, I understand, but that is, or those are some of the numbers that we do use when we're looking at things such as, so as we think about Roman numerals and what they're telling us as far as the numbers go, then we apply that to the coordinate plane because each of the corners has a specific name or a Roman numeral assigned to it. So notice how we start in the top right and it says quadrant 1. We go counterclockwise. So all of my points that have positive, positive that I ran forward and jumped up for are going to be in quadrant 1. I'm going to go counterclockwise as I name these quadrants. So a quad, once again, means 4, and my coordinate plane is divided into 4 equal boxes. My top left, so if I'm going to plot something in there, I'm going to run backwards, so it's negative, and then I'm going to jump up, so it's positive. That's my quadrant 2. If it's going to be negative, negative, so I run backwards and jump down, that's quadrant 3. And then if I'm running forward with a positive number, but jumping down with a negative, so a positive, negative, then I know that's going to be quadrant 4. Oftentimes, they're just going to be shown with the Roman numeral instead of the word quadrant. Once again, quadrant means 4. This is divided into 4 equal pieces. So starting in the top right where everything is positive, positive, I have quadrant 1. I go straight across. Top left is quadrant 2. I go down, so bottom left is quadrant 3. And then bottom right is quadrant 4. So when we talk about plotting, then we review what that means. Notice we have two ordered pairs here where it talks about being able to plot them. And we're either going to see them called ordered pairs or they're going to call them coordinates. And the coordinates just means what number is located on the X and what number is located on the Y. So now some of you didn't quite get the how do I write an ordered pair concept in Unit 1. So I'm going to ask you to make sure you take this note that you know there is a proper way and there's only one way that I can write ordered pairs. When I write an ordered pair, when I write coordinates for a point that's going to be in a quadrant on a coordinate plane, I have to start with parentheses. Then I have to give my X number. So if it's going to be a positive number, it's going to go forward. If it's a negative number, it's going to go backwards. So whichever number is going to be first, that has to be my X axis. Separated by a comma because I want my X and my Y to be separate from one another because they are two different actions. My second one is Y. If it's positive, I'm going to jump up. If it's negative, I'm going to jump down. And then I end it with a closing parentheses. So every ordered pair has to be written inside of parentheses, separated by a comma, with the X going forward or backwards first, followed by the Y jumping up or down. So some of you are like, yeah, we've already talked about that this year, and we have, but we're just needing to review it because not everyone got it the first time. So when we look at the idea of what the x-axis is, that is my horizontal line. Once again, on the x-axis, if it's a positive number, I'm going to go forward. If it's a negative number, I'm going to go backwards. And then my y-axis, my vertical line, is what goes up and down. And if it's a positive, I'm going to go up. If it's a negative, I'm going to go down. So when we review what these ordered pairs are telling us, they're telling us where we're going to locate something, such as in quadrant 1. So when I look at quadrant 1 versus quadrant 2, what's going to be different is the x, because the x in quadrant 1 is going to be positive, where the x in quadrant 2 is going to be negative. But the y's are both going to be positive. When I look at quadrant 3, though, it's going to go backwards and down. So it's going to be negative followed by a negative x followed by a negative y. And when I look at quadrant 4, I'm going to have a positive. I'm going to go forward, but I'm going to jump down. So it'll be followed by a negative. So when I look back at Unit 1, Lesson 3, we talked about how we plot things. And most of the things that we plotted were on the quadrant 1 type graph because everything was positive, positive. We run and then we jump. Once again, if it's positive, then I'm going to run forward. If it is positive Y, then I'm going to jump up. So knowing how to run and jump in order to put a plot. Once again, two numbers make up a ordered pair, but I only put 1 point. I have some of you who are putting 2 points for every ordered pair. So basically what I do is I take my finger and I'm going to put it where the X tells me to stop. And then I move my finger up to where the Y tells me to stop. And then I put my pencil down on the paper and I put my point. So if I know where I'm going to run and jump, such as the ordered pair of 5, 6, then I know that I'm going to run forward to 5, and then I'm going to jump up to 6. I don't put a point until I get to my second location. There isn't going to be a point where the X is unless the Y happens to be a 0. So when I'm plotting things on the coordinates plane, then I simply follow the directions of running and jumping every single time. Once again, I'm either going to run forward or backwards, depending on if it's positive or negative, and then I'm going to jump up or down, depending on if it's positive or negative. If it's positive, once again, I run forward. If it's negative, I run backwards. For my second number in my ordered pair, if it's positive, I jump up. And if it's negative, I'm going to jump down. So knowing where I'm going in these 4 quadrants helps me indicate where I need to put a point. But I always need to go back to the starting point every single time. And once again, we call that the origin. I always go to 0, 0, which is right in the middle of my coordinate plane. And then I go from there, moving either forward, backwards, or up and down. So when I look at what the coordinates or quadrants, excuse me, are telling me what type of coordinates I'm going to have, then when I'm looking at quadrant 1, I should know that I'm going to have to go forward and then I'm going to have to jump up. So I'm going to have any ordered pair that is going to be positive going forward and then positive going up. For quadrant 2, then I see that I'm going to have to run backwards to get into quadrant 2. So if I'm running backwards, then my first number, my x, has to be negative. But I'm still going to jump up, so my y is positive. For quadrant 3, then I see that I have to run backwards to get to quadrant 3. So my first number, my x, is negative, as indicated in this chart. And then I have to jump down. So my second number is also negative. When I look at quadrant 4, then I'm running forward, so it's positive, but I'm jumping down, so it's negative. So every time I'm in quadrant 1, I know my ordered pair has to be a positive x and a positive y. Anytime I'm plotting in quadrant 2, then I know that my x has to be negative, my y has to be positive. If I'm plotting in quadrant 3, then I know that my x has to be negative and my y has to be negative. And if I'm plotting in quadrant 4, then I know my x has to be positive and my y has to be negative. Well, what about if I'm plotting something on an axis, right? So if I'm going to have a positive x axis, but it's going to be on the axis itself, then I know. So now it's time to do some practicing. So you should have this handout where you have two different shapes. I'm going to walk you through the first shape, and then I'm going to have you do the second shape on your own. Because once again, we just need to review this. Some of you, you've got this down, you do fantastic on your images, and some of you, I'm really not sure what you're creating. So let's review and make sure that we have this down. So I'm going to be plotting these in order, and each time that I plot one, then I'm going to cross out the letter so I know I've already used it. So my first point, point A, is going to be at -2, -3. Now, as we just looked, if it's a negative negative, then I know it's going to be in quadrant 3. All of these happen to be in quadrant 3 because they're all negative negative. So I just have to make sure that I'm going to the left and then dropping down or in my ordered pair. So my first one is -2, -3. I have to go to the left -2, and then I have to drop down -3. Notice I haven't put a point where the x and then the y. I'm going to put a point where they both meet. So going over 2 and dropping down 3, then I put my first point. On my second one, it says I'm going to go -2 and -5. So still going over -2 where I had started before, but this time I'm going to continue to go down until I get to -5. That's when I put my point, when I get to my second number. Now I'm going to connect them, right? So as we're doing these, we want to connect from one point to the next because we're making shapes. For point C, then it tells me I'm going to go -3, -3. So if I'm going to the left -3, then I know my second number tells me to jump down to -3. So when I jump down to -3, then I can put my point. And once again, I want to connect it. Since I'm at C, I want to connect it back to B. Then I can do the fourth one, which is point D. It tells me to go backwards because it's negative to the 4 and then jump down to -5. So when I go to the left 4 and down 5, I can see where my next point needs to go. And I'm going to connect D to C. So I'm just keeping them in the order in which they're listed, connecting one after the other. When I start getting a whole bunch of points, if I try to just say, well, I want to plot them first and then connect all the dots, then I get really confused as to which ones were in which order. For E, my fifth one, I'm going to go to the left to -4 And then I'm going to jump down to -3. I put a point and then I connect it to my previous one. I cross that one out and I'm ready for F. I'm going to go to the left, -6, and then I'm going to jump down 3. Then I'm going to connect it to my previous one. Now, if I'm going too fast, you can stop and pause this video in between each and every one of them that I do so that you can keep up. I cross out F and I'm ready for G. G tells me to go to the left 4 because it's -4. And then I'm going to jump down 2 because it's -2. And then I can put my point. And then once I have my point, I connect it back to F, which is the previous one. So now I can cross out my G. H tells me now to run all the way to the left, which is -6, and jump down just 1. So -1, I put my point, and then I connect my 2 points. Crossing out H, I'm ready for I. I tells me instead of going all the way to -6, now I'm going to go to negative. So then we're ready to put the last 2 points. I tells me to go to the left 4 now and then down 1. So I have negative. I connect those points and then I'm left with one more point. Notice that J and A are the exact same ordered pair. So what that's showing us in this shape is we're just going to close it in. And a lot of the times when we make these images on coordinate planes, then we know that we are closing in individual shapes. Now I would suggest that you color that in. You know, I'm going to do yellow. You can choose which color you want to use. But then notice that you have a shape 2. This is where I want you to pause the video and do it and come back and check and see how you did. All right, so hopefully you've done it, you've graphed it, you have the second shape, and now you can check to see what you have. And hopefully you have a rocket because we are the Granville Weld Rockets. And hopefully you have your points in the correct spot. So just making sure that you run and then you jump. So that's all there is to today's math lesson, reviewing plotting on coordinate planes. You now have an assignment to kind of go along with the current month that we're in. And if you have questions, if you're struggling, then please come and ask.